In case you missed our last episode of Life with the Polites MRL, Marriage, Relationships, and Love, here's what you missed. I said earlier, tonight I want to focus on something I believe that's very sensitive in the relationship realm. When we decide to sacrifice our relationship for the sake of another relationship and we leave God out. And I say that simply because we have many people in relationships today, and we all know a few. If they look at those they're involved in, most of them has chosen to compromise in not having a God-centered relationship. Now, this is by no means me being judgmental. This is just real talk. Not judging anyone. This is just real talk. But here's a question for my social media family. How do you compromise having a committed relationship with someone without God? Think about that. Whereas there are so many of us that do so. God is supposed to be at the core of every relationship. His presence in our relationships helps us. It helps build. It helps guide. It helps prosper our unity within our relationships. How do we do it? Even more on a personal note, think about this. Our relationships with God will always set the tone for every other relationship that comes in our lives. How can we compromise this? How can we compromise this? But before I go on any further, I don't know if we can or not, Lady P, but I want to open up our conference line if they're available. For anyone that chooses to share comments or call in, our Life with the Polites conference line is open for live calls to the podcast. The number is 855-565-4143 or 301-349-6733. Again, let's think about what we're talking about tonight. Sacrificing our relationship for another person and leaving God out. How do we do it? How do we do it? Our relationships should grow. Our relationships with God should grow. And it should grow to where that we are fundamentally growing more and more with God, not closer to conforming to the ways of the world or embracing the world's culture. And I think what we have a lot in today in relationships is that we allow, and this is not being pointed toward anyone or relationships. Again, this is just real talk. We shouldn't allow feelings for someone to compromise truth. I'm going to stop there for a moment because that's the real part of this conversation. We shouldn't allow our feelings for someone to compromise God's truth. That's what I'm talking about. Or strengthening our walk with God. Because this is what we're setting ourselves up for. When we do that, we allow what's unacceptable to become acceptable. What's also very important here is that we must not lose sight that any relationship, and I think, again, this is very important for us to really look at the big picture. We shouldn't lose sight that any relationship that pulls you or pulls me away from God, that's called a distraction. That's called a distraction. And here's why. But here's what I want us to really think about. Because I need many of us to understand that the enemy's biggest fear is for us to become what God has created us to be. And this is why the enemy is committed to trying everything to make us lose focus. Many of us, it's our choosing, choosing. It's our choosing to bring or persuade or even pursue the wrong types of people in our lives. And you know what that does? That helps the enemy's cause. How many of us have swallowed that pill? As believers, as Christians, we are to develop the qualities of Christ and becoming like him. That's what we need to focus on, because a lot of that behind the scene deals with what I call personalities, because much of our personalities are formed through our choices. And when we make new choices, we have to understand that we are letting go the old nature to receive the new. I'm trying to tie this back so we can actually see how the walk is supposed to manifest in our lives. Whereas the new creature is being formed by the truth that we were talking about. The truth of the word. That's what you call the alignment. That's the alignment that a lot of us miss out. Let me give it to you another way, aligning with the topic in which we're talking about. Think about it this way. It's much easier for God to put the right people in your life if you're willing on letting go the people who don't care about your spiritual growth. Does that make any sense for anybody? It's easier when we are in aligned, when we don't compromise the truth. It's easier for God to put the right people in our lives when we are willing on letting go the people who don't care about spiritual growth. The challenge for so many people in relationships sometimes is the thing they mostly are afraid of doing. The very thing that will set them free. It's two of them. It's called letting go or losing someone. And if anyone's been in a real relationship, in and out, they understand those two realms for real. So here's a question that I need someone to go and talk to us about. Why are we so afraid of losing people? Why? Why? Why are people so afraid of losing people? In essence, we should be afraid of losing ourselves. Losing ourselves by trying to please people and others around us. Why are people so afraid? Let me give it to you this way. And again, this is a little personal. We shouldn't be afraid to start over if it's God's will. When we're led spiritually down this path, we're not starting from scratch. We're starting from, listen to me, experience and with godly standards. And when I talk about experience, I'm talking about what we have lived through. And to validate that, I want you to listen and try to understand what the King James definition is for the word wisdom. The definition from the King James Dictionary says wisdom is the quality of having experience. It's knowledge and good judgment. And I need us to grab hold of this because this is about encouragement. Because many of us, we settle. Many of us, we settle on compromising. And again, let me help someone understand the definition of the word compromise. When you compromise, the definition says that you are making concessions. It's talking about making accommodations for someone who does not agree with a certain set, listen to me, of standards. And normally they're your standards. There's things that you are compiling towards that you need in a relationship. And when we decide that we are going to compromise, that's what we're opening the door for. We're opening the door for concessions. We're opening the door for accommodations. Because we don't want to be, I'm going to say it, we don't want to be alone. We want somebody. And many times we're led down that pike. It's our failure in having a mindset of being afraid of losing someone. And that leads us to fear. I said fear. Fear to say what you really feel when taking on a relationship. It's real talk. And the bottom line of that is that when we're fearful in the end, this is what we're left with. And a lot of people have to go through this to really understand to themselves that I have to do better. We spoke a little briefly about wisdom. By definition, wisdom means the quality of having experience. But when people allow themselves to go through the trail of fear on taking on the relationship at the back end, when we are fearful, in the end, we're left with dealing with spiritual decline. We're left with dealing with spiritual decline, and that decline leads to spiritual death. And here's the part that we got to understand. We got to recognize that spiritual death happens when we compromise. When we compromise, one compromise at a time. We're opening up the door to our own defeat because we don't want to be alone. We want to take on a relationship because we want to have someone. Let's shed a little more light on this because I want us to really get an understanding of where we're going and how we can go about this. We have to be very mindful of where and how we let the door of the enemy in our minds in regards to bring upon this fear. We got to do that, and we got to understand that part. But if you're sacrificing your relationship with God for the sake of a relationship with someone, then that person, he or she, listen to me, isn't God's best for you. Think about that. If you have to sacrifice your relationship with God to be with someone, he or she, they're not God's best for you. When a relationship is pulling us away from God, there is danger signs written all over it. All over it. But many of us, we resist. Another word for resist is fight. Many of us resist to acknowledge those signs. You know why we exist? Because we're focusing on what we may have to give up instead of what we have to gain. People want a great relationship, but they want it on discount. To obtain or build a great relationship, you must be willing to pay the cost. You have to pay the cost, which requires guidance from God. You have to hear God's guidance. That means we must understand and we must maintain our relationship with him, not sacrifice our relationship with him, no matter the cost. But how many of us get that? How many of us get that? Acceptance is a choice. And a lot of us put our own selves in that swim lane. Acceptance is a choice. Look at it this way. There's only two ways out of a problem. You either accept what's happening, you see the positive, and you choose a peaceful state of mind, or you, listen to me again, here's that word again, we resist. We fight against it. We fight against choice. We fight against it and we become miserable. And then we struggle against why there's no harmony, why there's no agreement with self. I didn't say relationship, with self. We do that. We do that. And then we sit back. For many of us, we want to avoid the acceptance. And we avoid the acceptance to keep peace. But the only thing that we're actually doing, we're starting a war within by doing so. Because we got to deal with self. You have to deal with self. We don't have to struggle to reach God. I'm going to say that again. We do not have to struggle to reach God. We have to struggle to tear away from what we have allowed to separate us from Him. That's where the rubber meets the road. That's where the rubber meets the road. And for some people and some of us that needs to really understand where I'm going with, allow the truth of rising inside of you fuel your awareness of God. That's what we need for us to stay aligned with our relationships, but also what we need to make ourselves stronger in the spiritual war up here. I say one of the action things that I want us to all to consider and recognize. I want the audience to share their comments. I want the audience to ask questions. And I think this is very important because your engagement can also help someone see a newer viewpoint or outlook to their situation. We have to be willing on coming forth and understanding exactly some of the things that we have to do to tie in to make us a better you, for us to become better people. You know, we're talking about surrendering our relationships with God to have a relationship with someone else. And, you know, there's a part of this argument, again, that I want to share, that I believe that it's very important, is that I don't believe a lot of us understand what surrender truly means. We use it a lot. We talk about it a lot, but do we know the origin? Do we really understand what surrender means? The word surrender is a battle term. It's a battle term. Biblically, think about the word surrender. Think about it. Think about the word. Think about the word of God. Surrender. Think about the epic wars that were fought in the Bible. What did they do? How did they end? Somebody surrendered. And it's like the wars that I'm talking about, but for us, our surrender implies that we are giving up all of our rights to God. How many of us truly understand what surrender means? Surrender to God is about total dependence on God for all decisions pertaining to life and godliness. Surrendering to God is an act, A-C-T. It's an act of faith. It's keeping hope alive. But for those that really need to get something out of this message, it's letting go of control and trusting God. We have to continue to move to the center. We have to continue to move to the center to where God is. We have to be able to allow God to feed us. We must be able to follow God's will and lead no matter the cost. no matter the cost. Let's sit there for a moment. No matter the cost. Is being alone that important to so many people that they compromise their relationships with God? Even if that means that you must let go, that's going to hinder your growth in your relationship with God. Now, I know for a lot of people, I'm walking on eggs with them when it comes down to having this kind of faith and trust in God. We want God, but we want the relationship more. Real talk. So we compromise. We surrender to God. That's what we have to do. We have to understand how important when we go to that level of faith and trust in God, what we are aligning ourselves with, and the new us that's going to come forward. Considering a relationship that we want to put higher than our relationship with God. Because when we surrender to God, there's no other relationship that's greater. A life of purpose can only be filled when we put God first and make Him the center of our lives. But we come to this point a lot of the times where we struggle with this. And there can be many outlets for a lot of people to why they get to this point. But again, for us to really get a full-size view, let's even talk a little to round this thing about. If we even commit ourselves to understanding the fullness of biblical love, that can even help us understand exactly how important our relationship with God should be. Because when we're talking about biblical love, as the word teaches us, it's not emotions and feelings. That's not biblical love. Biblical love is attitudes and action. That's biblical love. It's attitudes and actions that seek the best interests of a person, regardless of how we feel toward them. That's biblical love. So I say to somebody out there right now, if you love someone and you are struggling with this topic, move them closer to God. That's the best thing you can do. For that person you love, instead of compromising your relationship with God, move them closer to God. Move them closer to God. We all should focus on wanting to be with someone who also wants to make their relationship with God a priority. That's how we get to where we're going. That's how we harness the fullness of all that God has for us. But we have to rely on what we have in God and pursuing as God takes us through the highs and lows. You know, everyone wants a perfect life. It's not. Sorry, it's not going to happen. With a perfect life, there is no experience. There is none. There's no failure. That's why it's non-existent. But we allow God and we trust in God to take us through no matter how low we get or even how high we get. We should worry about being seamless as God continues to feed and teach us. Grounded. That knowing that God will always be there no matter what we go through and no matter what decisions that we fell down on. I said earlier, starting over is not a bad thing if it's God's will. But we have to have the faith, the trust, and the willingness to let go of what is going to allow us to live through those experiences that God is now reshaping us for. But how many of us really are up for the test? How many? How many are willing to give the Heisman and say, you know what? My relationship with God means that much more to me. How many of us will take a stand and understand, I hear what you're saying, but to sacrifice my relationship with God is something that I'm not going to do. I need God more in my life than I need you. That's taking a stand. That's fulfilling what God wants to see and hear from us. That's a steady hand. That's having the commitment to God to want to know Him more, to want to know Him deeper, to want to allow and put your trust and your faith in Him while you're lonely. Because that's the problem with a lot of people. A lot of people don't want to be alone. A lot of people don't want to be lonely. And I know there's a difference. I get that. But it's the physical part that people gravitate to. We need God in our lives more than we can ever think about. And when we're talking about relationship, whether it's a committed relationship or whether it's you and God is pruning you and God is shaping you and God is preparing you, regardless of what side of the spectrum you're on, that relationship with God is what's needed to help develop you. There is no such thing as a finished product. There's only growth in God. No perfection, growth. Perfection died on the cross. There's always growth. And as we continue to grow and we develop an ear of obedience to allow God to guide us through these relationships, whether or not, like I said, whether or not we're in a committed relationship or whether we are in a relationship with God and God alone and God is directing us and feeding us and carrying us along the way, we are in a state of mind of where God is guiding and directing. He's purifying. Some people put it in a reference as we're in the bubble. But we have to choose. We have to choose. We have to choose whether we are willing on being committed to God or business as usual as the world will live. Because the world will tell you that you have to have somebody. The world will tell you, why not? Go get you somebody. But a relationship with God will protect you. A relationship with God will build you, will guide you, will form you. And as the seasons manifest in your lives, prepare you for a relationship that will not have you be subjected to sacrificing a relationship with God. No one should have to be placed in that position. And like I said earlier, for those of us that find ourselves in those positions, for those of us who have accepted allowing themselves to be pulled away from God, they're in danger. And they're ignoring the signs. It's very important for us to understand that our growth in God is what's going to always keep us. It's going to keep us. And for a lot of people, we don't have an enormous amount of patience and we don't like to endure. That's why I use the word keep. Because practically, when God keeps us, we're able to smooth the edges of being impatient and enduring. Because outside of that, we don't want to endure, and we are very impatient people. It goes back to what I said earlier. The world will tell you you must have someone, regardless the state you're in. But let's keep in mind what we spoke of earlier in regards to biblical love. Biblical love is about attitudes and actions, the right ones. The right ones in which are built on the Word of God. And where we are to remain as a priority as God takes us through seasons where we can understand the change that goes about in our lives as we have been encouraged by God revealing more to us through Him. The encouragement that we get from God, from our relationship with God, will always be steadfast in our lives. It'll be something that we will continue to seek, something that we will continue to go back to, regardless of the situation, the issue, or the problem. The steadfastness of our relationship with God will always take us back to God without compromise. Without compromise. We must remain strong. And, excuse me, I know that's easier said than done. And for a lot of us, that's very challenging when the world feeds us everything but that. But our challenge is more. What's important is for us to really love God and be with God in a sense in which our faith is now being held upon Him as we continue to go through the things in which life will form us and keep us. My prayer is that the audience that listens and really spends a little time with this message will really understand what it means to be compelled to maintain a relationship with God and how important that is. How important it is to not sacrifice your relationship with God for a relationship. It's where we have to remain. We have to remain to where our loyalty resides with God. And when we've been able to spiritually harness that, yes, it won't be easy because our battle will continue to remind us, look at the world, look at they're happy. And what we don't see is that they're not happy. It's just the delusion of them going through. And I'm not judging on I don't want anyone to feel that this is all about judging on anyone. It's not. It's a practical way of wanting to be stronger in God. And every relationship can become stronger in God if He's invited. Your relationship can't be strong if God's not a part of it. So again, this is not about judging. This is an encouragement for us to sit back and understand and find out why is it that we struggle in this particular area. Why? I mentioned a couple of adjectives. I said fear. I said loneliness. There's probably many others. But why do we allow ourselves to be placed in this particular form of life when through the Word of God provides us the answer that a relationship with God will manifest the promises, the faithfulness, and the strength and the encouragement of what the best that God has for us. The best that what God has for us is not subtraction. It's always multiplication. God will always give. God won't subtract. And we live in a world right now that that's major. But that's the culture of the world that we have. And that's the culture of the world that we live in today.